Police officers Cole Bryant and Dean Sutter slammed Judge Eleanor Brooks against a courthouse door on live television as millions watched in shock. She had come to deliver justice for her father's killing by police, but instead became the victim of the same brutality she vowed to end. Will this violent attack silence her or spark a reckoning that forces America to finally change? If this moment moves you, like and share to spread her fight for real justice. Now let's step inside the story that stunned a nation. I remember the cold first, the kind that slides under a coat and settles in your bones. Chicago winters don't whisper. They announce themselves. That morning, the red on-air light over our camera blinked to life, and the National Court Network control room went quiet, in the way a room only gets quiet when 12 million people are about to listen. In my headset, the countdown hit 0. We were live. I was posted in the marble corridor outside the federal courtroom, standing just off frame with a field monitor pressed to my chest. The screen showed a split, the courthouse feed on the left, the anchor desk on the right. Our anchor filled the nation in 3 years since the shooting of Harold Green, a black retired police lieutenant traffic stop gone fatal today, the first full day of testimony. I didn't need the briefing. I'd read the file twice. Everybody on our crew had. She appeared at the end of the hall, like a line drawn with a ruler, straight back, steady pace, nothing wasted. Judge Eleanor Brooks, 52, tall, thin, in that wiry, enduring way, a navy coat falling neatly over a charcoal suit. Her face looked composed carefully, but her eyes gave away a private weather, something heavy that hadn't blown through. In her left hand, she carried a black briefcase clamped down like a lifeline. I'd been told she kept a keepsake of her father in there, something small that somehow weighed a ton. Around us, the building woke up. Reporters pressed against velvet stanchions outside, talking over each other into mics. A camera from a national morning show tried to sneak a long lens through the doorway until security waved it back. Inside our truck, Michael Cho, our director, voice like a metronome, stacked the day's shots. Camera 2, hold the doorway. 3, give me her approach. If she looks up, stay tight. The temperature in the corridor ticked a degree colder when 2 uniforms shifted near the courtroom entrance. Sergeant Cole Bryant and Officer Dean Sutter were posted there like bookends. I'd seen Bryant around the building, good posture, heavy jaw, the kind of neatness that tries to pass for calm. Word among crews was he'd been feeling heat lately. Too many headlines, too many questions. Sutter I didn't know as well. Tech-savvy, someone had said. Quick to anger, someone else had added with that shrug people use when they've already decided. They clocked her early. Bryant's eyes tracked Eleanor, the way a level bubble hunts center expression, tight but unreadable. Sutter did what I've watched 100 guys do when they want you to know they can make your life difficult. He smiled without warmth. It wasn't loud, but it was meant to be seen. Let me hear the hallway mics, Michael said, and in my ear the ambient sound rose, the soft click of heels on marble, the hiss of heat through vents, the low murmur of law clerks moving like a tide. Eleanor drew even with me for half a breath. Up close you could see how she was doing it. Each inhale measured, each exhale a decision. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't need to. The country was already looking at her. Outside, the press pack surged. Judge Brooks, Judge, over here, does today set a new precedent? Do you plan to? The questions braided and broke, then fell away as she passed them by. Inside the control room, Michael's voice clipped along. Anchor, stand by for picture-in-picture. If she stops, we're in. If she goes through, we're wider. She kept going, and the air around the door changed. You can feel it when authority meets authority, the way a room tenses like a muscle. Brian adjusted his stance 1 foot forward, a gate lowered across a private drive. Sutter shifted to fill the remaining space, and together they made a wall. I've filmed enough of these moments to know the next 5 seconds decide whether a day ends with paperwork or sirens. Eleanor stopped an arm's length away. No theatrics. Her briefcase hung at her side. The knuckles were white but not trembling. When she spoke, it was courtroom clear, the tone that makes a jury look up. Good morning, officers. My monitor caught the micro movements, the narrowing of Bryant's gaze, the way Sutter leaned in weight on the balls of his feet. On my headset, the anchor's script dissolved. She didn't need words now. The hall had taken over. Ma'am, Bryant said, voice stiff, this corridor is restricted during live broadcast. You'll need to step back. From the truck, hold. Too tighter, don't spook it. If Eleanor was rattled, she hit it well. I'm heading to courtroom 6A. She said no edge on it, just fact. I have business there. Sutter's smile didn't reach his eyes. He angled his body a fraction, just enough to turn a passage into an obstacle. Business can wait, he replied. Orders are orders. I saw Bryant's right hand then. Not much, just the way it settled heavier on the baton sitting on his hip. A habit, maybe. Maybe not. On my monitor, the frame caught that hand like a secret whisper in a quiet church. In my ear, Michael's tempo quickened. That's our picture. 3, hold the hand. 2, watch your eyes. Don't blink. Somewhere behind me, a clerk coughed. Farther down the corridor, a cart rattled, a lawyer murmured into a phone. A pair of students in ill-fitting suits shuffled papers, like they might shuffle fate if they tried hard enough. 12 million people couldn't hear my heart, but I could. It counted the seconds. Eleanor's gaze flicked not to the men, but past them through the narrow crack of the courtroom doors, to the benches and the seal and the flag and the place she was supposed to stand. When she looked back, she lifted her chin by a degree you'd measure in a mirror, not a ruler. Officer, she said, I have a lawful right to enter. The anchor whispered, oh my God, barely a breath. Michael didn't whisper. Stay with it. If he moves, you move. Outside, the crowd roared a little, and then quieted the way a tide does with a long pull. In here, everything felt sharpened. Bryant's jaw worked once. Sutter's fingers tapped a rhythm on his radio he probably didn't know we could see. I've learned that moments like this are actually built earlier in 100 decisions, 1,000 excuses. But they always arrive the same way, slow then, all at once. Eleanor took one step closer. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a retreat. It was the distance a person covers when they choose not to be turned aside. Bryant didn't move. Sutter's smile thinned to a line. Camera 3. Michael said, give me her approach. I framed her, and for a heartbeat I saw what the rest of the country would see when our anchor got out of the way. Not just a judge, not just a daughter, but a person walking toward the place she had earned, through a doorway that had never been meant to close on her. The marble reflected her shoes. The glass reflected the red on-air light. Somewhere 12 million living rooms leaned forward. That was the hallway. That was the temperature. That was all before anyone raised a hand. The hallway seemed to tighten as Judge Eleanor Brooks reached the heavy oak doors of courtroom 6A. I could feel it from where I stood with my monitor. The air grew sharper, like the moment before a thunderclap. That was when Sergeant Cole Bryant moved. He stepped out fast and square, a single motion that turned the corridor into a barricade. His boots clicked once on the marble and stopped inches from Eleanor's path. Ma'am, he barked, voice edged with steel. This area is restricted during live broadcasts. Turn around. Now. Eleanor stopped, not a flinch in her shoulders. She adjusted the lapel of her navy coat as though she were settling into a meeting she had scheduled herself. When she spoke, her words were even carrying the low authority of a courtroom that didn't need to shout. Officer, I have every lawful right to enter this courtroom. Every syllable traveled through the courthouse microphones, out through satellite feeds, and into the living rooms of more than 12 million Americans. On my monitor, the sound levels spiked clean and bright like a bell struck in a cathedral. Before anyone could breathe, Officer Dean Sutter slid forward. He didn't rush. He closed space the way a door closes, deliberate and final. Shoulders squared, he angled himself so the wall and Cole formed a perfect human gate. It was an old tactic every cop learns without being taught, a presence barrier meant to press the other person back without laying a hand. Eleanor didn't step back. Her heels stayed planted in the exact groove of the marble. Cole's eyes narrowed. The tension in his jaw tightened like a drawn bowstring. Then he leaned in just enough for the cameras to catch the shadow on his face. His voice dropped into something colder. Sweetheart, he said, the words slicing through the air like a quiet insult. This isn't your TV show. The word hung there ugly and unmistakable. It carried across our headsets and straight into homes from Boston to Phoenix. In the control truck, I heard someone sucking a breath. The anchor's prepared script died in her throat. Millions of viewers heard it too. They knew what that word meant in that moment: dismissal, contempt, a reminder of who he thought held the power. Eleanor lifted her chin, eyes steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned her gaze slow, deliberate, straight into the nearest camera lens, peeking through the courtroom door. For a heartbeat, it felt as if she were looking through every screen in America. Perhaps she said each word measured. You should check who's presiding over that proceeding. The corridor went silent. Even the hum of the heating ducts seemed to fade. I swear the whole building leaned in. In the control room, director Michael Cho snapped to life. Hold that shot, he ordered, his voice a clipped staccato. Camera 2, stay tight on her face. Camera 3, track Brian's hands. Do not cut. We are live. Don't you dare cut. On my monitor, Eleanor stood framed between two officers, a single figure, against a wall of uniform and authority. Brian's knuckles whitened on the baton at his hip. Sutter's lips pressed to a hard line, his body a silent dare. Viewers across the country were already reacting, phones lighting up, hashtags firing like sparks. But here in the marble hallway, there was only the echo of Eleanor's calm and the low electric charge of a standoff waiting to break. That was the moment you could feel the balance shift. She hadn't moved more than a breath, but the story already had. We all knew, whether we were behind a camera, watching from a couch, or standing 10 feet away, that something irreversible had just begun. The hallway snapped like a live wire. Cole Bryant's voice cracked the air. Enough, sharp and sudden, a thunderclap in the marble corridor. Before anyone could move, he lunged. His hands clamped onto Judge Eleanor Brooks's shoulders, and with a violent shove, he drove her backward into the massive oak courtroom door. The sound of impact crack shot through the microphones and out across 12 million television sets. It wasn't just a noise, it was a shockwave. I felt it in my chest even from 10 feet away. Eleanor's head struck the brass nameplate with a dull metallic thud. Her briefcase slipped, skidding across the marble. For a breathless instant, she looked weightless, then collapsed hard onto the floor, the navy of her coat spreading like ink across the cold stone. Dean Sutter was on her before the echo faded. He seized her right arm in a grip meant for violent arrest, forcing it behind her back. She's resisting a federal order, he barked, his voice bouncing off the marble like a siren. The words were pure theater, loud enough for the cameras, loud enough to plant a story that wasn't true. Inside the courtroom, chaos answered. I heard the scrape of benches and the rush of feet. Bailiff James Carter flung open the door, his voice carrying over the stunned hush. What's happening out here? Behind him, the National Court Network's anchor. Rebecca Hill spoke into a microphone that suddenly felt too small for the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing what appears to be a physical assault on live television outside the courtroom. Her words trembled as the cameras cut to the hallway feed. Eleanor lay motionless, one cheek pressed to the marble, a streak of blood beginning to pool beneath her dark hair. For a terrifying second, I wondered if she'd lost consciousness entirely. The entire nation wondered the same thing all at once. Bryant, chest heaving, snapped at his shoulder radio. Subject resisted, fell while being restrained. The line was practiced, the cadence of 100 reports filed and signed. But every lens in that hallway, our main feed, the backup cameras hidden in light fixtures, even the feed from a journalist's handheld, had captured the truth. Eleanor had stood perfectly still until Brian's charge. The story he was trying to invent was already dead on arrival. In the control truck, director Michael Cho didn't blink. Record on all angles, he barked. Do not cut. Double back every feed. The hum of hard drives kicked in a mechanical heartbeat, preserving every frame. Dean kept his grip tight, eyes flicking nervously between his partner and the small red camera light above the door. Sweat gathered at his temple. He had to know the narrative was slipping. Carter knelt beside Eleanor, checking for breath. Judge Brooks, can you hear me? Stay with me. His voice mixed urgency with the formal respect of a man who already understood who she was, even if the officers hadn't. The microphones didn't miss a single syllable. Viewers heard the word judge and gasped in living rooms from Seattle to Miami. Twitter feeds detonated. Within minutes, Shakespeare justice for Eleanor lit up timelines, climbing past 1 million mentions before the ambulance siren even reached the street. Facebook live comments poured in faster than the anchor could read them. Unbelievable. She wasn't resisting arrest, those cops now. Rebecca Hill's voice steadied on air. What you are seeing is unfiltered. We cannot and will not turn away. Every network in the country is now carrying this live. I watched Eleanor's fingers twitch, a faint sign of life that felt as powerful as any speech. The nation exhaled with me. But Bryant didn't ease up. He stayed over her like a man guarding not a suspect, but a collapsing story. And through it all, the cameras kept rolling, each second a permanent record, each frame another nail in the coffin of their excuse. What they thought could be explained away with a routine report had instead become the most public act of police violence in modern memory. That was the moment America changed its posture. From inside that marble hallway, I could almost hear the collective outrage gathering speed across the country, a storm racing along wires and screens, already too big for anyone to stop. Blood trickled warm and steady down Judge Eleanor Brooks' cheek, a metallic taste pooling at the corner of her mouth. For a moment, she stayed still on the marble floor, the overhead lights blurring into halos. Around her, the hallway buzzed radio chatter, gas hurried footsteps, but inside that daze, a sharper sound stirred her own breath, deep and deliberate. Then she moved. Not much at first, just a slight lift of her head, a twitch of fingers, but it was enough to silence the crowd. Bailiff James Carter leaned close, relief breaking across his face. "Judge Brooks, stay still. Paramedics are on the way." Her eyes opened fierce and steady despite the blood. "My briefcase," she whispered. The words were rough, but they carried command. "Ma'am, please, Carter urged you need medical care." "My briefcase," she repeated louder this time, each syllable cutting through the clamor like a gavel. Around us, people exchanged startled glances. Even in pain, she sounded less like a patient than a judge issuing an order. Carter hesitated only a second longer before sliding across the marble to retrieve the black case that had skidded from her grasp. He placed it beside her as the crowd instinctively stepped back, making room without knowing why. Eleanor drew a long breath and pushed herself upright. Carter reached to steady her, but she waved him off with a firm hand. Blood streaked her sleeve and dripped to the floor, but her back straightened until she stood at full height. Slowly, deliberately, she unlatched the case. From it, she drew a folded black garment. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a piece of cloth against the pale marble. But as she shook it free, the shape became unmistakable. A judicial robe. A gasp rolled through the hallway like a low wind. Reporters fell silent. Even the anchor in the live feed stopped mid-sentence. I heard only the soft rustle of fabric as Eleanor raised the robe and settled it across her shoulders. Blood still marked her temple, a crimson contrast against the black cloth. The effect was electric. One moment she was a bleeding woman on the floor. The next she stood transformed, wounded, yet unbowed, the living embodiment of the very justice the building claimed to house. She looked first to the cameras, then to the two officers who had attacked her. Her voice, though raw, carried to every corner of the corridor and through every broadcast microphone. "I am Judge Eleanor Brooks," she declared, "and I will preside over this trial today." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant sirens seemed to hold their breath. Cole Bryant took an involuntary step backward. His face, moments ago flushed with anger, drained to ash. The baton that had felt like an extension of his arm now hung useless at his side. Dean Sutter's jaw slackened, his grip on the radio faltering as if the very weight of it had changed. They both understood at once what the cameras were already transmitting to the nation. They had not merely assaulted a woman in a courthouse hallway. They had assaulted the sitting federal judge assigned to the most watched police brutality trial in years, live in high definition before millions of witnesses. Eleanor's gaze held them steady and unyielding. "No act of violence," she said, her voice firm, "will prevent justice from being served." In the control room, Director Michael Cho barely breathed. "Stay tight," he whispered to his crew, though no one needed the reminder. Every lens was locked on her, bloodied, robed, unshaken, standing like the very idea of the law made flesh. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to that single image, a judge rising from her own blood to reclaim the bench. It was more than defiance. It was history forming in real time, a declaration that no weapon, no uniform, no sudden burst of violence could silence the pursuit of justice. And in the stunned faces of Cole and Dean, the nation saw what she already knew: their careers, their freedom, and their lies had just collapsed in the space between one sentence and the next. The courtroom felt different once Judge Eleanor Brooks returned to the bench, bandage stark against the black of her robe, the marble still marked where her blood had pooled. The hush inside wasn't just respect. It was anticipation. Everyone knew she was about to bridge the morning's violence with the tragedy that had brought them here in the first place. Eleanor steadied herself, one hand resting on the oak railing. 3 years ago, she began, her voice low but clear. My father, Harold Green, drove home from my nephew's birthday party. He never arrived. The words seemed to draw the room inward. Jurors leaned forward. A few reporters lowered their pens. I could almost hear the collective breath of millions of viewers on the other side of the camera feed. She described the night in spare, vivid strokes. Harold Green, a retired black police lieutenant with a spotless record, had been stopped on a quiet residential street by officers Kevin Ross and Mark Willis. The stated reason was a broken taillight, a detail already disputed by neighbors who said both lights were working. My father kept his hands on the wheel, Eleanor said. He followed every instruction. He asked calmly why he was being detained. For that, he was shot in the back. At her signal, a court technician dimmed the lights and activated the evidence screen. The jurors turned as body camera footage came to life. Grainy streetlights lit the frame, Harold's silver sedan parked neatly, both brake lights glowing red. Ross's voice came first, abrupt and clipped. Do you know why we pulled you over? Harold's reply was steady. No, officer. I believe everything's in order. Seconds later, the tension on the recording rose like an unseen tide. Command's overlapped tones sharpened. Then in chilling clarity came the fatal shouts. Gun, gun, followed instantly by 3 shots. Harold never left his seat. He never turned toward the officers. The video made that undeniable. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. On my monitor, a juror pressed a fist to her mouth. Across social media, live captions exploded, hands on wheel, shot anyway. Eleanor let the silence settle before she spoke again. Ross and Willis wrote that their cameras failed. They claimed my father lunged for a weapon. They claimed they feared for their lives. She raised a single page of their incident report, the neat type stark under the courtroom lights. Every word of this, she said, is a lie. Next came the forensic counterpoint. A ballistics chart illuminated the screen, 3 entry wounds, all to Harold Green's back, each angled downward, proof that he was seated and facing forward. A veteran medical examiner confirmed the findings, voice steady, as he repeated the phrase, not consistent with self-defense. Eleanor turned back to the jury, and for a heartbeat, her gaze locked with the camera's red light. What officers Ross and Willis did to my father, she said slowly, is exactly what officers Bryant and Sutter tried to do to me this morning. They escalated a peaceful encounter, invented a threat, and reached for force instead of reason. The room absorbed her words like a single body. Even the fluorescent hum seemed to fade. Then she added a truth most had never heard. My father wasn't only a retired lieutenant, she continued. He was a man who spoke out against corruption inside the department, who refused to look away when fellow officers hid misconduct. He believed integrity was the job. She paused, letting that settle. Some of his own colleagues resented him for it. Resentment can fester, and sometimes it waits for a moment, a dark street and a broken taillight excuse to settle its score. That final revelation carried a different weight, one that reached beyond a single night's violence into years of quiet hostility. It explained the chill beneath the traffic stop, the swiftness of the gunfire, the careful lies afterward. By the time Eleanor closed the file and faced the court again, the story was no longer just about a tragic misunderstanding. It was about premeditated contempt, the kind that punishes honesty and turns procedure into a weapon. I glanced at the jury. Some were blinking back tears. Others sat rigid, jaws set. Across the country, millions of viewers were seeing more than a murder. They were seeing how easily a good man's courage could become a motive for his death, and how his daughter now stood wounded but unbroken to expose it all. The afternoon session opened with a different kind of tension. Morning sunlight had softened into gray, but the air inside the courtroom felt charged, as if the building itself understood what was coming next. Judge Eleanor Brooks, still wearing the black robe streaked faintly with her own dried blood, adjusted a folder on the bench and nodded to the clerk. Call Special Agent Maria Lopez, she said. A trim woman in an FBI blazer stepped forward. Her presence carried the weight of a federal seal. She took the oath with crisp precision, then faced the jury. Agent Lopez, the prosecutor, began. What did your team discover when reviewing the courthouse surveillance logs? Lopez opened a digital tablet and tapped twice. At 9:47 a.m., she said, her voice steady. Officer Dean Sutter used his security credentials to access the internal camera network. He then manually deleted live hallway footage less than 5 minutes before the assault on Judge Brooks. The courtroom rippled an audible intake of breath. From my seat behind the press rail, I heard someone whisper, "They tried to erase it." Lopez didn't pause. However, she continued. The courthouse employs a multi-layer backup system. Each camera automatically stores footage on 3 independent servers, local offsite and encrypted federal cloud. None of those backups failed. She looked straight at the defense table. There was no camera malfunction. What happened in that hallway was captured from multiple angles in full audio and high definition. Attempts to erase it were unsuccessful. Eleanor leaned slightly forward, fingertips resting on the polished oak. Her expression never changed, but the room could feel the quiet force behind her stillness. Next, the prosecution called Eric Nolan, a young courthouse security officer in a plain gray suit. He looked nervous as he raised his hand for the oath. "Mr. Nolan," the attorney asked gently, "can you tell the court about the internal training sessions Sergeant Bryant supervised?" Eric cleared his throat, then spoke with the careful bravery of someone stepping into history. "There's a phrase they used," he began. "Move first, ask later." Sergeant Bryant repeated it in nearly every briefing. He said, "Hesitation gets you hurt." He called it taking control of the narrative. What did that mean in practice? It meant, Eric said, voice tightening, that you assert force, immediately physical force if needed, then build the justification afterward. He praised that approach. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Someone behind me whispered a single word: culture. The prosecutor nodded. "So in your experience, this wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment?" "No, ma'am. It was routine. We were trained to think that way. Everyone knew it." Eleanor's eyes closed for a heartbeat. When they opened again, there was a glint of pain as sharp as resolve. Agent Lopez returned to the stand to widen the lens. "Our federal inquiry didn't stop with this courthouse," she said. "The same pattern of sudden camera failures has been flagged in multiple states. We are now reviewing a series of incidents where recordings vanished just before or during contested use of force events. We will pursue each case." Gasps and soft exclamations moved through the courtroom like a tide. The revelation wasn't local anymore. It was national. For a long moment after Lopez stepped down, the courtroom fell into an aching quiet. All eyes turned to Eleanor. She sat perfectly upright, but her left hand gripped the wooden edge of the bench so tightly the knuckles whitened. A single tear slid down her cheek, unhidden, unhurried. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and measured, but it carried to the furthest corner. "This court exists to protect the law," she said. "My father wore a badge believing it would protect the truth. Today we have seen how the systems he trusted can be bent to hide violence instead of prevent it." No one moved. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Eleanor brushed the tear away with the back of her hand and straightened the stack of papers before her. "But let the record show," she concluded, "that the truth does not vanish with a keystroke. Not today. Not ever." Her words settled over the room like a final gavel strike, quiet, unshakable, and impossible to edit out. The courtroom lights glowed steady, but the air inside felt tight like a rope pulled to its last knot. Cameras hummed softly. Every eye was fixed on the witness stand where Sergeant Cole Bryant sat, stiff-backed hands locked together as if holding on to what little defense he had left. Claire Jordan, the lead prosecutor, rose from her chair. She moved with the deliberate calm of someone who already knew the answers to every question she was about to ask. "Sergeant Bryant," she began, her voice sharp enough to slice the quiet point, "me to the regulation, any regulation that authorizes you to strike a woman who is standing still and not resisting." Bryant swallowed. "I felt threatened," he said quickly, the words almost rehearsed. Claire didn't blink. Threatened, she repeated, her eyebrows lifting just enough to register disbelief. "By what exactly?" "By a woman holding a leather briefcase." A few jurors shifted forward, waiting for his answer. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the faint tremor in his jaw. Her demeanor suggested escalation, Bryant muttered. Before the next excuse could take shape, Claire cut in with quiet precision. "Sergeant, you were armed. You stood with a partner. You blocked a single unarmed woman. The only thing she carried was a file of court documents. Where is the escalation in that?" The silence stretched until it seemed to hum. Even the faint buzz of the overhead lights felt loud. From the bench, Judge Eleanor Brooks leaned forward. Her voice, measured but unyielding, joined the cross-examination. "Sergeant Bryant, she said you claim you were in fear for your safety. Tell this court what you saw in my eyes that justified violence. Was it fear or the sound of a citizen exercising a lawful right to enter her own courtroom? Bryant's mouth opened, opened again. No sound followed. Claire let the moment tighten, then delivered the next strike. Isn't it true, Sergeant, that your own training emphasized de-escalation and proportional force? Yes, he admitted, barely audible, and yet you chose the opposite. Why? Before he could assemble another half answer, a door opened at the side of the courtroom. Eric Nolan, the young security officer who had testified earlier, stepped back to the stand. His face was pale but resolute. Mr. Nolan, Claire said, turning smoothly. You have something to add. Eric's voice carried the weight of someone who understood this was the moment to tell the whole truth. Yes, he said. Sergeant Bryant once bragged in briefing that the fastest way to control a situation is to take them down first and sort it out later. Those were his exact words. A collective gasp rolled through the room. One juror pressed a hand to her mouth. The cameras caught every startled glance. Claire pivoted toward Bryant. Did you say those words? Bryant stared at the table. The silence became its own kind of confession. Judge Brooks didn't let the weight lift. So, Sergeant, she said quietly, was it fear you felt or confidence that you could act without consequence? Bryant's lawyer rose his voice, a rushed protest. Objection, Your Honor, argumentative. Sustained for the record, Eleanor replied evenly, then added with unmistakable authority. But the question stands in the mind of every person watching. The defense attorney tried to regain footing, mumbling about split-second decisions and law enforcement stress. But his words landed flat. Each line of argument seemed to collapse under the footage, the testimony, the live broadcast that refused to forget. Claire stepped closer to the jury, her voice low but resonant. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen the video. You have heard the officer's own colleague describe a culture of strike-first policing. You know the truth. The television cameras tracked every flicker of movement, Bryant's clenched fists, the sweat at his collar, the faint tremble in his lawyer's hands. The country was watching in real time as a defense unraveled. By the time Claire rested her case, the silence in the room was heavy with finality. The prosecution had not just asked questions. They had stripped away every excuse until only the facts remained. And those facts left no place for Sergeant Cole Bryant to hide. Night fell on Chicago, but the city didn't quiet. By the time Judge Eleanor Brooks finished the day's session and stepped briefly onto the courthouse steps, the plaza outside had transformed into a river of candlelight. People filled every inch of pavement. Nurses still in scrubs, retirees in heavy coats, students carrying homemade signs. Their chant rolled upward in waves, justice for Eleanor. Justice for Harold. It wasn't just Chicago. Before dawn, the same glow of candles appeared in New York's Union Square, then Los Angeles City Hall, then London's Trafalgar Square. By sunrise, photos from Toronto, Berlin, and Sydney showed crowds, thousands deep, holding placards that read, Yara, justice for Eleanor, and Yara, justice for Harold. From the air, each gathering looked like a constellation stitched across continents connected by a single cry for accountability. The response from Washington came just as fast. That night, the White House released a rare midnight statement calling the assault on Judge Brooks and the murder of her father a turning point for American justice. By morning, congressional leaders of both parties were in emergency session. Cameras caught the Senate Majority Leader stepping to a podium under flashing lights, pledging immediate hearings on a national police reform bill. House members drafted language for what some already called the Harold Green Justice Act, federal oversight of body cameras, civilian review boards, mandatory de-escalation training. The energy was not limited to protesters and politicians. From precincts large and small, young police officers began posting videos of their own. One clip after another appeared on social feeds, officers standing in uniform outside precinct houses or at home kitchens, speaking into phone cameras with voices steady and clear. I became a cop to protect a rookie in Atlanta, said. After what we saw with Judge Brooks, we can't stay silent, added another from Denver. Within days, the hashtag Nachos Community Guardians trended worldwide as thousands of officers signed open pledges to reject strike-first policing and embrace constitutional training. Newsrooms across the globe followed every step. The BBC interrupted regular programming for live updates. NHK in Japan ran nightly specials. France's Le Monde published a front-page editorial titled, "A New Era of Accountability." In Nairobi, Cape Town, and Rio de Janeiro, radio call-in shows debated how their own justice systems might learn from what viewers called the Chicago broadcast. What struck me most was how seamlessly the world adopted Eleanor's language. Anchors quoted her declaration, "Justice is universal or it is meaningless," as if it were an international treaty. Editorials described her as a judge for all nations, and even state leaders who rarely agree on anything used the same phrase. This is a watershed moment. Inside the Chicago courthouse, Eleanor worked late under the quiet hum of a near-empty building. Yet outside, the movement that her courage sparked refused to rest. What began as a single bloody confrontation in a marble hallway had become a global call to redefine law enforcement and justice itself. By morning, as fresh headlines circled the planet, one truth had settled beyond debate. This was no longer only Eleanor Brooks's fight. It was a worldwide reckoning, and it was just beginning. The 9th day of testimony ended under a sky the color of pewter. But inside the federal courthouse, every light burned bright. Hours had passed since the jury filed out to deliberate, yet no one moved from their seat. Not the reporters shifting on stiff benches, not the lawyers with half-empty coffee cups, and certainly not Judge Eleanor Brooks, who sat in stillness, her black robe a dark anchor against the oak bench. Shortly after 7 p.m., a quiet rustle broke the tension. The bailiff opened the side door. 12 jurors entered, their faces, grave eyes fixed straight ahead. The entire room seemed to inhale and hold. Across America, millions of screens flickered as living rooms, bars, and hospital waiting areas leaned in to witness a decision years in the making. The foreman, Robert Martinez, held the verdict forms in both hands as if they carried physical weight. When he reached the stand, the hush deepened until even the camera hum felt loud. "Mr. Martinez," Eleanor said, her voice even, but threaded with gravity, "has the jury reached a verdict in both cases before this court? We have your honor." The clerk stepped forward to receive the envelopes, the paper crisp as it passed. Martinez began with the case that had haunted the nation for 3 long years, the killing of Harold Green. In the matter of the People versus Kevin Ross, he read, his voice steady on the charge of second-degree murder. "We find the defendant guilty." A ripple of sound, half gasp, half prayer, rolled through the chamber. Martinez did not pause. "In the matter of the People versus Mark Willis on the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The words seemed to travel through the marble itself. For Harold Green's family and for countless families who had waited for justice that never came, the verdict landed like long-delayed rain on dry ground. Martinez turned the final page. "In the matter of the People versus Cole Bryant on the charges of assaulting a federal judge, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. In the matter of the People versus Dean Sutter on the same charges, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." No one spoke. Some jurors dabbed at their eyes. In homes across the world, people erupted, clapping, shouting, some weeping, as the broadcast scrolled the words, "Guilty on all counts" in bold red across the bottom of the screen. Judge Brooks took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of generations. When she spoke, her words were measured, but rang with a quiet thunder. "Today, this court affirms that justice does not bend to badges, titles, or the color of a person's skin. Justice stands with the truth, and it stands for all." She turned briefly toward the defendants. "The law you once used as a shield is the same law that now holds you to account. That is how a democracy protects itself." Then she addressed the cameras, the unseen millions who had stayed with her through every hour of testimony and every heartbeat of waiting. "To those watching around the world, remember that justice is not a favor granted. It is a duty fulfilled. We must keep choosing it day after day." For a long moment, silence filled the room like a living thing. And then the outside world answered. On social media, hashtags flared like fireworks. Justice delivered. Joshua Eleanor Brooks. Truth prevails. Within minutes, they were trending in dozens of languages. Screens from Chicago to Seoul pulsed with the same message: the system can work if people dare to hold it accountable. In front of the courthouse, thousands of candles lifted in the cold night air as church bells and smartphone alerts blended into a single rising cheer. Commentators on live feeds called it a turning point for American justice. News anchors simply let the picture speak: strangers, hugging children on shoulders, people weeping in relief. Inside, Eleanor let the gavel fall with one last resonant strike. The sound echoed through the marble chamber and out into the waiting world, an unambiguous note of closure, and a promise that the law, when faced down by courage, can still rise to meet the truth. 6 months later, a pale winter sun rose over Chicago, catching on a new bronze plaque at the courthouse entrance. The inscription read, "Harold Green Federal Courthouse." On that plaque, a smaller line marked the very spot where Judge Eleanor Brooks had fallen bleeding and unbowed. That morning, Eleanor walked slowly up the granite steps. A faint scar curved just above her eyebrow, less visible now but unmistakable. She stopped, rested her fingertips on the cold bronze letters, and closed her eyes for a quiet breath. The scar, once a wound, had become a public emblem of resolve. Inside, the atrium hummed with a different energy than the day of the assault. Banners and community art lined the walls, photographs from the night of the verdict, sketches of candles held high across continents, children's drawings of balanced scales. Reporters waited, but this time without the frantic tension of breaking news. They were here to witness something built, not broken. The Harold Green Police Accountability Act, born out of that unforgettable trial, had passed Congress with rare bipartisan support. Eleanor could still remember standing beside the president as he signed it into law. The act required every law enforcement agency in the United States to maintain public tamper-proof archives of body camera footage backed by federal oversight. It also established an independent national commission with the power to investigate any claim of equipment failure or suppressed evidence. No officer, no department could hide behind a silent camera again. The ripple spread beyond paperwork. Across the nation, police academies were rewriting their foundations. The old warrior mindset training manuals with their lessons about domination and strike-first tactics had been stripped from classrooms. In their place came a new curriculum called Community Guardian, built around constitutional rights, de-escalation, and empathy. Recruits now learned that restraint, not force, was the first measure of strength. And something remarkable was happening in neighborhoods once frozen by mistrust. Communities and police departments had begun holding an annual day of reconciliation where residents and officers worked side by side on service projects and shared open forums on safety and justice. Children who once crossed the street to avoid patrol cars now ran up to hand officers candles and paper hearts. The Harold Green Foundation, created from donations that poured in after the trial, was already helping families across the country secure legal aid when confronted with police violence. Grants went to cover medical bills, court fees, and trauma counseling, real tools for real people who once felt invisible. In the Midwest alone, dozens of wrongful death suits had been reopened, this time with evidence that could not be buried. Eleanor herself remained at the center of it all, though she never sought celebrity. When a national news anchor sat across from her for a live anniversary interview, she spoke with the same calm conviction that had steadied her on the bench. Justice, she said, doesn't arrive on its own. It isn't handed down like a gift. It comes when we refuse to look away, when we carry the hard truths into daylight and keep them there. Justice is born from our courage. The interviewer let the silence sit, letting viewers feel the weight of that line. It wasn't rhetoric. It was the lived memory of a woman who had turned her father's murder and her own assault into a movement. As the evening ceremony drew near, crowds gathered once more outside the courthouse. Families held candles, their flames winking against the cold air. Choirs from neighborhood churches joined their voices, singing low and strong. The camera crews backed away to give the scene space their lenses, capturing the slow swell of light. Eleanor stepped onto the steps again, scar catching the glow of hundreds of small fires. Behind her, a banner stretched across the facade. Justice is a daily choice. She turned, surveying the crowd, activists and officers, grandparents and students, people of every race and faith, and smiled, the kind of quiet smile that carries history in it. As she lifted her hand in acknowledgement, the choir's song rose into a single, steady note. The television feed pulled back in a wide rising shot, the courthouse lit like a beacon, the city streets beyond threaded with candlelight. The image said what words could not: the fight was not finished, but the path was lit. And in that fading winter light, the scar on Judge Eleanor Brooks' forehead was no longer just a memory of violence. It was a seal of courage, proof that when a society dares to face its own darkness, true justice can begin and continue long after one historic day. What an unforgettable journey of courage and justice. Judge Eleanor Brooks turned tragedy into lasting change, proving that true justice doesn't depend on a badge, a title, or the color of our skin. Her strength reminds us that fairness is built every day by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent. If this story moved you, please like this video and share it with friends and family so her message can reach even farther. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful real-life stories that inspire action and hope. Your support means the world to our creative team. It keeps us motivated to keep bringing you meaningful stories like this, stories that shine a light where change begins.